My piece is entitled The R Word, and it delves into the taboo, the discomfiture, the sheer feelings of discomfort that people feel when discussing racism. Racism, or pointing out racist words or racist tendencies, has become something that is almost as bad as the racist act itself. Because of this, I feel like if we're taking a step back, and we should feel the need to discuss race since it affects all parts of our lives. And one of the most important ways to address this and the institution of systemic racism on the whole is if we try to have these conversations with our children from the time they're young.
In my research, I came across this passage from a transcribed conversation of Beverly Daniel Tatum. The name of this is Can We Talk? I will now read a very short part of this conversation as I find it accurately describes how our inherent bias and how our perceptions shape the people around us. Most importantly, the little people around us. Cultural racism. The cultural images and messages that affirm the assumed superiority of whites and the assumed inferiority of people of color. It's like smog in the air. Sometimes it is so thick it is visible. Other times it is less apparent. But always, day in and day out, we are breathing it in. None of us would introduce ourselves as smog breathers, and most of us don't want to be described as prejudiced. But if we live in a smoggy place, how can we avoid breathing the air? If we live in an environment in which we are bombarded with stereotypical images in the media, are frequently exposed to the ethnic jokes of friends and family members, and are rarely informed of the accomplishments of oppressed groups, we will develop the negative categorizations of those groups that form the basis of prejudice. And I would like us to pay a special attention to that. And special is a Trini term that we use to really emphasize when we want to draw attention to a point. And it is really important that as a people and as individuals, we come to terms with the level of our privilege, with the level of our prejudice, even if it is inherent, because again, I will reiterate, it is not enough to simply be against racism. We must be actively non-racist, and the only way to do that is to engage in anti-racism work. And this comes in the form of these conversations that I will go ahead and explain precisely how to have this conversation. As society is not equitable and racial bias does exist, the colorblind approach denies children the validity of their experiences of the world. Because the impact of racial bias is visible, not allowing children to process this injustice is confusing, and it denies them the opportunity to see themselves as agents of change to resist injustice. Colorblindness fails to acknowledge the impact of racism on all people, and further, does not push white people to do the important work of reckoning with the legacy of white supremacy in our lives. Durman Sparks, Ramsey and Edwards, 2006, D'Angelo, 2012. I wanted to start off this slide with this quote for the sole fact that many people use colorblindness as a defensive mechanism which keeps them from wanting to engage in these topics amongst themselves, amongst their peers, and with their children. As a result, it is just another way to avoid these conversations that we need to be having. While I was doing some preparation for this segment, I came across a Facebook article. It basically said that parents in Utah were given the option of opting out of Black history. And this goes directly in line with Beverly Daniel Tatum's previous comment about smog breathing. It goes to show that when we do not make a conscious effort to recognize the accomplishments of other races, we fuel this type of cultural racism where we aren't really changing, but in fact we're simply regurgitating all of the other greats. And don't get me wrong, I love Shakespeare just as much as the other person. However, there are many different Black and people of color authors who have beautiful writings. And it is important that we introduce the classics, but we also be careful to diversify that, to give that appreciation to the young minds that we're currently molding. That goes to show that anti-racism work is not a Black or people of color subject. This is something that requires everyone to engage with, to take a part of, to celebrate, just as we have all these years. Silence is insulting. It is. When we refuse to address these things, as I mentioned in the previous slide, it simply gives children the impression that this topic is taboo, and it almost reinforces a type of discomfort that we ourselves may not even be aware that we are passing on. But if anyone has children, I don't, but I have many nieces and nephews. They follow everything you do. And especially if you want them to do the exact opposite of something that you did, that is the one thing that they will do. Because that's how children work. They learn by mimicking. It really hurts students when their teachers only acknowledge what Black people have done for this country and not what this country has done to them. This was a quote taken from an American author. However, the same thing can be said for Canada. What I would like to see in a history class, and not just at university level, but at much younger, is a discussion of Africville in Nova Scotia, and residential schools, the impact that they had, and the distrust that is still going on to this day between the First Nation Indigenous societies and the government. All of these are topics that would help inform children, and it's not something that should be foisted on them at a much later age, because I think we're all aware that it is very, very easier. It's much easier to unlearn I think it's easy to understand that it is much more difficult to teach someone to unlearn a trait or bad habit than it is to simply teach them the right thing in the beginning. And I think this is a good approach when engaging in anti-racism work with your students or your child. This allows for critical thinking, and there's nothing more exhilarating, in my opinion, than teaching children subject matter and then allowing them to have a discussion, even a debate, about the points that they have learned and about what they really believe to be right. It teaches them critical thinking. It teaches them awareness. It can also teach them good ways on researching the correct information, which is an undervalued skill that, as a history major, let me tell you, is very important later on. When we begin to have these conversations, it is important to put context behind it. Otherwise, we quickly find ourselves going into a lamentation of pain, and we find ourselves repeating the Black story with words of pain, of sadness. And while that is true, we should make that distinction that there is not only a narrative of pain within the Black identity. We have many other things that make us a people. And when you're engaging in this type of work, be sure to add those accomplishments, those celebrations, and look at it as a form of resilience, or through a lens of resilience. Something that pays tribute to the strength of the Black identity, which has not allowed us to buckle under the weight of these extremely difficult institutions, such as systemic racism. And I would like to use this quote, which says that teaching as an act of resistance and teaching as an act of healing are not mutually exclusive. What I take from that quote is that there are many ways to heal, and there are many ways to resist. By doing this type of work, we are in essence following in the footsteps of our ancestors. And myself, coming from a Caribbean island, this resonates especially true to me, because one of the forms of resistance was keeping our culture, was keeping the remnants of our language, of our behaviors, of our cultural practices, like susu, which is a way that the recently enslaved persons would put all their money together, and this would make it possible to purchase the type of acquisitions that would be typically out of our reach, because banks, as you know, would not give it to them. So all of these things, it's a type of resistance. When the effort or the entire reason is to destroy or change the culture of someone else, or to destroy that and put your beliefs on that race as a complete race, that is a form of resistance. I personally view anti-racism work through the lens of healing and resistance. I feel that this is the best way I can give a meaningful contribution to my community and society at large. And I think that the more we view this incredibly necessary work through those lenses, it kind of offshoots that type of fatigue that invariably comes with this emotionally charged work. Thank you for staying with me as we took this journey on anti-racism work and the importance of discussing racism with your young ones. I appreciate the time you've taken to listen to me, and on behalf of Black Lives Matter NL, we would like to thank the A.C. Hunter Public Library of Newfoundland, Labrador for having us discuss these topics. It is extremely important that we continue these conversations. And finally, what I would like everyone to take away from this video is that there is no perfect way to address race and racism with your child. In this segment, we went through a wide array of approaches people take in an effort to have these conversations. The only thing I ask is that we be responsible, careful, and we take the time to do the necessary research to give proper information to guide these minds. Thank you again for your time. And this is Raven Khadeja of BLM Steering Committee. And we wish you a safe and beautiful Black History Month.